Welcome back. We are now starting the wastewater section for the water and health class here at EKU. And in this video, we're going to just do an introduction. And I start off with just this image here. On the screen, you can see this old cast iron pipe running out into a lagoon pond. And this was a picture I took before I actually had to wade out there, where the lagoon pond actually was treating wastewater for a campground in southern Ohio for the state park system. So on that boat are my colleagues Bob Jones and Jason Hurst, and they were going to look at trying to figure out why this pipe was clogged up. Well, underneath of it, all the sewage had piled up to where this pipe comes out. And back behind it, about 1.5 miles worth of pipe was full of wastewater from a campground. We knew the wastewater was there because it was backing up through the floor drains of bathrooms in the campground. We actually had a snake ran, from like a big truck that went all the way 1.5 miles thinking there was a blockage in it, only to find out that it was spinning around out in the lagoon pond before it eventually freed the blockage. See where that pipe comes down right there in the lagoon pond? It was full of sludge. These lagoon ponds need to be maintained, and the Department of Natural Resources had not spent a lot of resources on cleaning these things out. So there's an old system here at that particular park where they have 2 lagoon ponds, one here and one here. And the first lagoon pond does a lot of the initial treatment, and then it runs into a second lagoon pond where it does more treatment, and then eventually the water that comes off the top of that, the far end of it, goes out to the lake and is actually discharged. And this lagoon pond being clogged up cost us a lot of money to have that snake run all the way out there. So when the thing clogged up again later that year, I had to go out there with chest waders and mix that stuff away from the edge of that pipe, only to hear all that stuff come rushing back out down that sewer pipe. And as I was hurrying out in my waders, waist deep in sewage sludge, I could just see the water starting to rise in the lagoon pond. I got out just fine. So wastewater is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's personal, and I've seen examples where our infrastructure struggles. Here's another example of a sewage lift station in an environment where I used to work at, where a large parking lot was constructed up here at an office park with big steel roofs, and when the water rains, all that stuff would rush off into the parking lot and come down this what once was a ditch or small creek. And then here you can see a sewer lift station flooded out. We're going to learn more about lift stations later on in this video, or these subsequent videos, but our sewage infrastructure is woefully underfunded. Our drinking water and our wastewater infrastructure are both ranked a D by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the upgrades are something that we just can't forget about, because much of our nation's health has improved because better water, sanitation, and hygiene. So in the textbook that we used to use, it would say that municipal sewage is mostly water, and it asked about what percent were, quote, impurities in the wastewater. And then it compared it versus salt water, like seawater, and actually was arguing by weight that wastewater here is actually more like water than seawater. In fact, I think it's like 96.5% of seawater is actually H2O. It's really, really salty, about 3.5% salt water. Whereas municipal sewage is often like 99% water or more. So we'll get into that here in a second. What does wastewater look like? So usually wastewater in the pipes, when it makes it to the wastewater plant, has this kind of appearance. You can see a lot of the larger matter has broken down. And then once it's gone through the entire wastewater system, this is what it looks like. It's actually pretty clear. And these pictures are courtesy of the city of Circleville in Ohio. Wastewater is, it can be fun to deal with. You have to have a good sense of humor. So that's me and my boy Paulie, you know, pumping down some latrines back in the day. So the park systems usually have a lot of areas that you can't run plumbing, and you can't have septic tanks either because you're too close to water. So you have to use vault latrines, and they fill up over time, and that sludge has to be removed, or in this case, heavy rains. So anyways, domestic sewage overall is the majority is rainwater. The sludge will sink to the bottom in our latrines, but at the wastewater plant, 99.9% of what arrives at the plant is water. And then that percent are, quote, the impurities. But this still adds up to a whole lot. So seawater is mostly salt. But what's the big difference? Well, the big difference is that salt obviously is, you know, not associated with infectious disease risk, all kinds of stuff. We'll just stop there. All right, so domestic sewage. It's not all created equally either. So some wastewater plants have stronger sewage than others. And every wastewater plant kind of knows what's normal for them. And for determining the strength of sewage, there are a couple common measures. And you would be surprised to know that actually a lot of wastewater plants prefer a stronger input in terms of they sometimes want a higher BOD and a higher TSS for what's coming into their wastewater plant. And you may wonder, like, why would they want a more rich sewage coming into their plant? And it's because our wastewater systems are like large ecosystems. And there are a lot of organisms that do all the breakdown, and they need to be well fed. And when they're not getting enough food from the wastewater, then they die. And then it makes it hard to break down future sewage events. So you want to keep them pretty well fed with a constant amount of food. So huge fluctuations in rain can cause wastewater systems to really struggle. So when the sewage is not strong, there's not enough food for the microbes, and the water is so diluted with rainwater, it makes it hard to actually break it down. So when we determine sewage strength, how do we do it? Well, the number one method is to measure the BOD. And we're not talking about this stuff, that nasty spray that, you know, yeah. So BOD. How can we determine the strength of BOD? You know, what is a high BOD versus a low BOD? We'll look at that here in a bit. Total suspended solids, TSS. That's another one where we can measure it to determine the strength of sewage. And then I put on here, what are other measurements that may help determine the strength of sewage? So you could imagine that we could actually measure the number of colony forming units, or MPN, of a common fecal organism like E. coli. And they can range into the tens and hundreds of millions per milliliter. So, I mean, there can be tremendous amounts of microbial life in our wastewater. All right, so what's in domestic sewage? What is in our domestic sewage? And a lot of what's in our domestic sewage is what's in our daily diet. So what's in the gut of a human being? So it's what we've had to eat. What's also in our domestic sewage? So protein, carbs, and stuff called FOG, fats, oils, and grease. And here's an example of what fats, oils, and grease can do to our wastewater pipes. They can clog them up. So some communities have had to put big campaigns out there telling people, don't dump grease down your drains. Not only is it bad for the drains in your house, you can clog them up on your own, they can also clog up the municipal wastewater pipes which then cost other people money. So we don't want fats, oils, and grease going down our drains. And we also know that there are things like chemicals and detergents and pesticides and cellulose, like plant fiber, pharmaceuticals, or birth control medications, even the stuff that we excrete, like if somebody uses birth control medication of some type, it will actually be metabolized, and the metabolites, and in the case of birth control, the EE2, I think it's ethinyl estradiol 2, that chemical maintains its kind of structure through the body and exits the body and can be measured actually in wastewater. And it doesn't necessarily always get treated well in a wastewater system and can actually make it through the wastewater plant to the downstream community below the effluent. So there's a lot in our wastewater. Before I go much further, I'm going to go back to this fats, oils, and grease issue. So there's a couple videos that I'm encouraging you to watch. You can watch either one of them or watch both that kind of get at, are flushable wipes really flushable? It's going to introduce you to the concept of what is a fatberg. And fatbergs are things like this that form in our pipes that can cause these blockages that can cost communities a lot of valuable money and time on maintaining their wastewater system. And like a lot of things that we focus on in public health, these things are preventable. So if people weren't flushing these things down the drain, then we wouldn't have to spend this kind of money on our wastewater systems doing that kind of work. We could spend our money on improving our system. So we'll stop here, and I encourage you to watch those videos, and we'll go on from there after you watch those videos.